officers go through the house. This time, it's different. They enter the house and they hear playing in the background classical music. And that's what Rachel would put on to help her little girl, Lily, fall asleep. So the first thing they hear is this kind of soft classical music playing in the background. And then they detect a foul odor in the air. And they immediately know it's the smell of death. They start to make their way upstairs. The music is louder. The smell is very strong. And then they go to the master bedroom where there is no doubt that the smell of death is in the air. They pull back a pile of sheets and a comforter, and they see a mother and child, arm in arm, dead.
On the morning of January 22, 2006, 2 police officers knocked on the door of a house in Hopkinton, Massachusetts. A friend of the family had called in a welfare check. She hadn't been able to reach Rachel Entwistle, a 27-year-old teacher, a new mother, a woman by all accounts filled with warmth and life, for 2 days. The officers walked through the house. Nothing appeared wrong. The home was tidy, quiet. They almost left. But something made one officer look again at the master bedroom. There was a pile of bedding on the bed, bundled up, still, too still. Underneath it, they found Rachel, and tucked against her chest, as if still being held, was her 9-month-old daughter, Lillian. They had been shot. Rachel's husband, the man whose name was on the lease, whose family photos were on the walls, was nowhere to be found. He had boarded a flight to England 38 hours earlier. Welcome to Dark Motive Crimes. I'm going to walk you through the story of Neil and Rachel Entwistle, who they were, how they ended up in that house in Massachusetts, what Neil was hiding, and what the psychology behind this crime tells us about a very specific and dangerous kind of person. Kindly support us by subscribing to the channel. We will also like to know where you are watching from. Stay with me. Before we talk about what was done to Rachel Souza Entwistle, we need to talk about who she was. Rachel grew up in Massachusetts, a bright and sociable young woman who studied at the College of the Holy Cross. She was the kind of person people remembered. Her friends described her as generous, funny, someone who lit up a room. She went on to earn a teaching certificate in the UK and spent years teaching English, drama, and theater studies. She loved her work. She loved her students. She met Neil Entwistle at the University of York while she was studying abroad. He was charming, educated, seemed to have ambition. They fell in love. They built a life together in England, and in 2003, they married in Plymouth. Then, on April 9, 2005, Lillian Rose arrived. Lillian, nicknamed Lily Bean by the family, was 9 months old at the time of her death. 9 months. She had just started to develop her own little personality. Rachel's mother, Priscilla, who lived back in Massachusetts, was hungry for every photo, every update. It was partly that pull, wanting Lillian to know her American family, that led the couple to move to the United States in late 2005. They stayed with Rachel's mother and stepfather, Joe Matarazzo, in Carver, Massachusetts, while they looked for their own place. In January 2006, they found it, a 4-bedroom colonial house on a quiet cul-de-sac in Hopkinton, about 26 miles west of Boston. The rent was $2,700 a month. They had only been living there for 10 days when Rachel and Lillian were killed. 10 days. Rachel had been excited about the new house. She had made plans to host her mother and her best friend that weekend. On the night of January 19th, the last night of her life, she called her family. She sounded happy. She had no idea what the man she was married to was hiding. On the surface, Neil Entwistle looked like a man who had it all. A beautiful wife, a healthy baby daughter, a new home in America, a master's degree in electronic engineering from the University of York. Underneath that surface was a completely different reality. Neil had been unemployed since September 2005. He had told Rachel, and apparently convinced her, that he had significant money held in an offshore account from a previous employer in the UK. That account did not exist. The income he claimed to be receiving, reportedly around $10,000 per month, did not exist. What did exist was over $30,000 in credit card debt, and an eBay account under investigation for numerous fraudulent transactions. Neil had been running a series of internet-based schemes, the kind of online scams that flood inboxes, work-from-home offers, spam campaigns, pirated software sales. None of it was working. The beautiful colonial house they had just moved into, the house Rachel was so excited about, cost $2,700 a month. They were furnishing it on credit, and Neil knew, with absolute certainty, that the bills were about to come due. There was more. Trial evidence would later reveal that in the days leading up to the murders, Neil had been searching the internet for deeply troubling information. He searched how to commit suicide. He searched how to kill someone with a knife. He searched information about euthanasia. These were not passing curiosities. They were the searches of a man who had, on some level, already made a decision, and was working out the details. Rachel knew none of this. Not the debt, not the fake income, not the searches. She was planning a weekend with her mother and her best friend in her beautiful new home. The night before, Rachel had called her mother. She was alive. She was well. She had no reason to believe that anything was wrong. Sometime on the morning of Friday, January 20th, 2006, Neil Entwistle used a .22 caliber handgun, a weapon belonging to his father-in-law, Joe Matarazzo, from whose home he had apparently taken it some time prior, and shot Rachel in the head as she lay in their bed. Lillian was lying next to her mother. Prosecutors would later argue that this was intended to be a murder-suicide, that Neil had planned to kill his family and then himself, erasing what had become an unbearable lie. But the suicide did not happen. Instead, what Neil Entwistle did next is the detail that stopped people cold when they heard it. He drove to his in-laws' home in Carver and returned the gun. He then drove home, covered Rachel and Lillian with bedding, and left the house. At 5 a.m. on January 22nd, less than 38 hours after the murders, Neil Entwistle walked into Logan International Airport in Boston and purchased a one-way ticket on British Airways. He boarded a flight to London at 8:15 a.m. While he was in the air, his wife and daughter were lying in that bedroom. While he was in the air, Rachel's friends were trying to call her. While he was in the air, the welfare check was being arranged. The bodies of Rachel and Lillian were found that evening, January 22nd, by officers conducting the second search of the home. They were found together, Rachel and Lillian, their arms intertwined. Massachusetts State Police moved quickly. Airport surveillance had already caught Neil on camera. They knew he had left the country. Investigators spoke with Neil by phone from England. In that recorded conversation, Neil told police he had come home that morning, found Rachel and Lillian dead, and, unable to bring himself to call 911, had driven to his in-laws' house looking for a gun to kill himself. He claimed he then decided he simply couldn't do it and flew home to England instead. It was during that same phone call that police asked Neil to confirm that his in-laws kept a .22 handgun in their home. They already had the gun. Forensic testing would confirm it was the murder weapon, and Neil's fingerprints were on it. When police retrieved the gun from Joe Matarazzo's home, Joe confirmed he had taught Neil to shoot it. Police issued an international arrest warrant. On February 9, 2006, 3 weeks after the murders, Neil Entwistle was arrested by British authorities. He was found at Royal Oak Underground Station in London, near his parents' home in Worksop. He initially indicated he would fight extradition. He then changed course and waived his rights. On February 15, 2006, Neil Entwistle was flown back to Massachusetts in handcuffs. The trial began on June 2, 2008, in Woburn, Massachusetts, more than 2 years after the murders. The delay was partly due to concerns about whether Neil could receive a fair trial given how widely covered the case had become. The prosecution called over 40 witnesses over 12 days. The defense called none. Neil Entwistle did not take the stand in his own defense. The only time the jury heard his voice was in the recorded police phone call, the one in which he explained, in a calm and measured tone, that he had come home and found his wife and daughter dead. When the detective on the call told him that the deaths were being treated as suspicious homicides, Neil's response, captured on tape and played to the jury, was a single word. Okay. Not devastation, not shock, just okay. Among the evidence presented at trial was a spiral notebook found on Neil at the time of his arrest. In it, he had written a draft letter, pretending to be a close friend of the Entwistles, pitching the exclusive rights to his story to media outlets and inviting bids from the highest bidder. Also found on him, a page torn from a British tabloid advertising escort and prostitution services. The prosecution argued that Neil had killed his family because he was drowning in debt and dissatisfied with his life, and that rather than face the collapse of the false persona he had constructed, he chose to erase it. On June 25, 2008, the jury found Neil Entwistle guilty on all counts. Judge Diane Kottmeyer sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences without any possibility of parole. She made clear this was a whole life term. He also received 10 years of probation on firearms charges, and a court order prohibiting him from ever profiting from his story. As the sentence was read, Neil Entwistle showed no emotion.
The sentence for first-degree murder is fixed by law. It is life without the possibility of parole. I understand the rationale of the Commonwealth's recommendation and Priscilla Matarazzo's request that consecutive sentences be imposed, in that it recognizes symbolically that that there is more than one victim. But I'm concerned that if consecutive sentences are imposed, people who are not familiar with Massachusetts law will have the erroneous impression that there is a possibility of release from prison on a sentence of first-degree murder when there is not. As a matter of law, a sentence for first-degree murder is an actual life sentence. Absent a pardon by the governor, there is no possibility of release from prison. A consecutive sentence would be purely symbolic. For that reason, I am imposing concurrent sentences for the murders of Rachel and Lillian Entwistle. That means that the defendant will serve, the actual sentence that the defendant will serve will be for both murders. In addition, I am going to impose a period of probation concurrent on the charges of possession of ammunition and possession of a firearm, with a condition that the defendant not profit in any way from the sale of his story, either by way of book or otherwise.
I want to spend a few minutes on the question that I know is sitting in all of your minds. Why? The lead prosecutor, Michael Fabry, said something after the verdict that stayed with me. He said, "Sometimes you just don't know why. No why would really explain this. There is no why." I understand what he meant, and he's right that no answer makes this acceptable. But I do think there is a psychological framework that helps us understand how a man arrives at this point. Forensic researchers who study what's called familicide, the killing of a partner and children together, have identified a recurring profile they call the civic respectable. This is a person, most often a man, who has built his entire identity around an external image of success, the good provider, the responsible husband, the man who has it together. The identity is not internal. It is entirely dependent on how he appears to others. When that image starts to collapse, through debt, failure, humiliation, the psychological experience is not sadness or regret. It is terror. The prospect of being exposed, of having people see behind the curtain, is experienced as a kind of annihilation of the self. In the most extreme cases, the person comes to see their family not as people they love, but as evidence. Evidence of the lie. Evidence that will survive and speak about what really happened. And so the logic, twisted and monstrous as it is, becomes, if there is no one left to witness my failure, there is no failure. Neil's internet searches in the days before the murders suggest he was in the grip of exactly this kind of thinking. He was researching death. He was imagining an exit that would erase everything. Rachel didn't deserve to be evidence of anything. She was a person. She was a mother. She was someone's daughter. And Lillian? Lillian was 9 months old. She was Lily Bean. They deserved a long life. They deserved the weekend Rachel was planning. They deserved everything. Rachel and Lillian Entwistle are buried together in Evergreen Cemetery in Kingston, Massachusetts. Their headstone carries the surname Souza, Rachel's family name. Lillian's death certificate was later amended to read, Father Unknown. Rachel's family read a victim impact statement at sentencing. Part of it said, Our dreams as a parent and grandparent have been shattered by the shameful, selfish act of one person, Neil Entwistle. Neil Entwistle is currently incarcerated at Old Colony Correctional Center in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. He has attempted further appeals and petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court. All have been denied. He will die in prison. If you've made it to the end of this video, thank you. These stories aren't easy to sit with. I don't think they should be. But I believe there's something important in understanding the mechanisms behind violence like this. Not to excuse it, never to excuse it, but because understanding is the first step toward recognition. The lies Neil Entwistle told Rachel weren't random. The control he exercised over her perception of their finances wasn't incidental. These were the conditions that left her with no warning, no way to protect herself or her daughter. The motive is always darker than it looks on the surface. That's what this channel is here to find. I'll see you in the next one.